7. Incest. Biblical law prohibits incest. Leviticus 18, 7-17, chapter 20, 11-12, 14, 17, 20-21, Deuteronomy 22:30, 27:20, and 22-23, and requires the death penalty for this offense in most cases. The laws on incest can be summarized briefly. Sexual relations and/or marriage is forbidden with a mother, father, stepmother, sister or brother, half-sister or half-brother, granddaughter, daughter-in-law or son-in-law, aunt or uncle, or with both mother and daughter. The punishment is death, except in cases of marriage with the wife of an uncle, with a blood aunt, or with a brother's wife, where the punishment was to bear their iniquity and die childless. Leviticus 20, 19-21. It is important to understand the meaning of childless here. It clearly did not mean that no children were born, because then and now incestuous intercourse and/or marriages have resulted in children. The Talmud reveals that a child born of incest or adultery was barred from regular marriage within the community. Such a couple were childless in that they had no legal heir in their progeny. The question which comes to the modern mind on reading the biblical law at this point is very simply this: why was it necessary to forbid such unappealing unions? One university professor ridiculed regularly the law that he stated he saw inscribed on an English cathedral: "Thou shalt not marry thy grandmother." Who, he demanded, wanted to marry his grandmother? His ignorance of history was notable. More marriages have been contracted in history, probably with property in mind, than sex. The seizure of estates by forced marriages and the prevention of the alienation or dispersal of family funds and properties by means of intermarriage within a family is an old story. The decline of European royal and noble families, as well as a weakening of strength in America's Jewish aristocracy, is a development which has run parallel with extensive inbreeding. The purpose of polyandry in Tibet was to maintain intact the inheritance in land. Instead of fractional heirship in the land, all the brothers shared a common wife and retained the land intact by conforming marriage to an ideal of a stabilized society and unbroken transmission of land. The laws of incest were given through Moses. Prior to that time, incest was clearly not considered wrong. Moses' own father, Amram, married a young aunt, his father's sister, Jochebed, Exodus 6:20. The practice of incest continued in many areas at a much later date. Thus, in Assyria, a problem existed because of the continued practice. A son, quote, after the death of the father, rests in the arms of his mother or stepmother, end quote. Whereas the father, quote, had to do with daughters and stepdaughters, end quote. The Assyrian practice represented perverse sexuality. That of Amram and others was a pre-legislative innocence of wrongdoing. In Egypt, full brother-sister marriages were the rule among the pharaohs, and even into the 2nd century AD, such marriages were the majority of unions in some districts of Egypt. The prevalence and acceptance of such marriages in Egypt made the Mosaic law all the more radical a break with the Egyptian past. Obviously, Adam's children married one another. Clearly, also, marriage with relatives did occur in subsequent history. The Bible speaks of Abraham marrying Sarah, possibly a half-sister, Genesis 20, verse 12. The two supposedly had a common father. The other instance, Amram, has already been cited. The records indicate close inbreeding in ancient times without serious or any genetic damage, whereas today, the genetic damage is great. The genetic inheritance of man was at that time sufficiently broad to make the possibility of too close a genetic strain in near relatives improbable. The genetic potentialities of Adam and Eve in Eden were wholly good. After the fall, which affected the total man, defects were no doubt present but recessive, coming to the fore only with progressive inbreeding. Arthur C. Custance has called attention to the present situation with respect to inbreeding. Quote, "From a mathematical point of view, the situation may be put in this way, that matings among first cousins, as in Darwin's case for example, or his sister Caroline's case, result in the offspring having identical genes in a ratio of 1 to 7. Many of these genes will be recessive mutants and therefore detrimental to the possessor when inherited homozygously. Mating of uncle to niece or nephew to aunt raises this ratio to 1 to 3. Matings among brothers and sisters raises this ratio often disastrously to 1:1." End quote. This danger did not exist in early times. Genesis is written with an awareness, for example, that murder is a sin, and adultery, theft, and false witness also, but with no awareness of any wrongdoing or danger existing in marriage within the prohibited degrees. At that time, no danger existed. Incest is a biological offense, but no less a fearful one, and the death penalty is God's ordinance. A study on risks to offspring of incest in The Lancet, London, England, February 25, 1967, page 436, is telling concerning the danger genetically. Quote, "Medical practitioners are sometimes asked about the advisability of the adoption of a child born as the result of incest. Such children will have an increased risk of being affected by recessive conditions. In order to get an estimate of the extent of this risk, in 1958 I invited children's officers to let me know prospectively of pregnancies or of new births in which it was known that the pregnancy or birth was the result of incest between first-degree relatives. These children were followed prospectively and anonymously through the children's officers. The children were known to me by number only, and all correspondence referred only to the child's number. 13 cases of incest, 6 father-daughter, and 7 brother-sister, were reported to me in 1958 and 59, and the latest information on them was in mid-year 1965, when the children were all 4 to 6 years old. I summarize there the information on these 13 children. 3 children are dead, one at 15 months of cystic fibrosis of the pancreas, confirmed at necropsy. 1 at 2.5 months of progressive cerebral degeneration with blindness, and 1 at 7 years 11 months of Fallett's tetralogy. This child had an IQ of 70. 1 child is severely subnormal, with much delayed milestones, and was considered non-testable at age 4 years 9 months, when she had a vocabulary of only a few words. 4 children are educatively subnormal. The known IQ of 3 are 59, 65, and 76. The remaining children are normal. The risk of parents sharing a recessive gene will be 4 times greater in cases of incest between first-degree relatives than it would be between first cousins." End quote. Custins draws some very important inferences from this and other data. Incest today is very clearly detrimental genetically in a very large percentage of cases. With each generation, the number of damaged genes increases rather than decreases. This means that the long history of man posited by evolutionists is impossible, in that the genetic deterioration would then be very far gone. Quote, "The biblical record actually shows only 77 generations from Adam to Christ, and if we add to this the 2,000 years since, we have something like 100 to 120 generations covering the whole of human history. Since the accumulation of defective genes is only meaningful in terms of their effect on the basis of successive generations, it is not altogether unlikely that the first human beings, namely Adam and Eve, were indeed perfect, and that the damage started to be done following the fall has accumulated until we reach the present situation in which there are still some possibilities of successful brother-sister matings, though the odds are against it. At the rate at which these mutations occur in each generation, according to the current genetical theory, one would not expect to find any undamaged segments of the individual's inherited stock of genes if the human race had been multiplying for thousands upon thousands of generations. We would all be so badly damaged by now that no brother-sister marriage could possibly succeed any longer. On the other hand, taking the biblical story as it stands, Adam's sons and daughters, Genesis 5:4, of whom Cain was one and his wife another, need not have been carriers of any more than a mere token of the damaged genetic stock, and such a marriage need not have endangered the offspring. There is surprisingly enough direct evidence in Scripture that this interpretation of the events is strictly true, for we are first of all presented with a list of immediate descendants for some 10 generations from Adam to Noah, who enjoyed what must be described as magnificent viability. Consider for a moment what was happening during this period of time. Previous to the flood, man may well have been shielded against at least one source of danger to the genes, cosmic radiation, by the existence of some kind of barrier in the upper atmosphere. There are many who believe that this barrier disappeared at the time of the flood and could indeed have been related to that event. The pre-flood population, both men and animals, be it noted, may therefore have suffered little damage to their genes throughout each succeeding generation while these environmental conditions existed." End quote. Clearly, history has witnessed genetic deterioration. Selective breeding in Christian countries has led to a degree to the progressive elimination of many defective persons, however. Among Armenians, arranged marriages prevailed in Armenia to World War I, and a routine demand of parents, before continuing with any further negotiations, was a clear family record genetically for 7 generations. As a result, many genetic defects were eliminated and unknown among Armenians. In every Christian country, some form of standard has prevailed. We can assume, moreover, that even as God introduced genetic problems with the fall of man, so with the progressive redemption of mankind, new conditions of life will be established. The evolutionist, however, can expect only progressive deterioration, and in fear of this, seeks to impose rigid totalitarian controls on man. These controls are needed by, and yet are impossible for humanistic man. He wants man's improvement, but he is by nature a lawbreaker. Thus, he deliberately seeks to break the very laws on which his survival depends. Attention has been called to the perverse sensuality of the Assyrians. Incest has existed among the perverted in every generation, but in some ages it has become a matter of principle to break the law. With the Renaissance and its revived humanism, it became a common goal to be immoral in an elegant fashion. The Pierre de Bourdeille, Seigneur de Brantôme, circa 1540 to 1614, is an able and vivid reporter of France in that era. As Georg Harstorfer noted, quote, "The courtier, Brantôme, sees all of history from the perspective of boudoir wit." End quote. Brantôme's casual treatment and easy justification of incest is noteworthy. Quote, "I have likewise heard speak of a great lord of a foreign land which had a daughter who was one of the fairest women in the world, and she being sought in marriage by another great lord who was well worthy of her, was bestowed on him by her father. But before ever he could let her go forth the house, he was fain to try her himself, declaring he would not easily let go so fine a mount, and one which he has so carefully trained, without himself having first ridden thereon, and found out how she could go for the future. I know not whether it be true, but I have heard say it is, and that not only he did make the essay, but another comely and gallant gentleman to boot. And yet did not the husband thereafter find anything bitter, but all as sweet as sugar. He had been very hard to please if he had otherwise, for she was one of the fairest dames in all the world. I have heard the like tales told of many other fathers, and in special of one very great nobleman with regard to their daughters. For herein they said to have shown no more conscience than the cock in Aesop's fable. I leave you to imagine what some maids may do with their lovers, for never yet was there a maid but had or was fain to have a lover, and that some there be that brothers, cousins, and kinsfolk have done the like with. In our own days, Ferdinand, King of Naples, knew thus in wedlock his own aunt, daughter of the King of Castile, at the age of 13 or 14 years, but this was by dispensation of the Pope. Difficulties were raised at the time as to whether this ought to be or could be so given. Herein he but followed the example of Caligula, the Roman emperor, who did debauch and have intercourse with each of his sisters, one after the other. And above and beyond all the rest he did love exceedingly the youngest, named Drusilla, whom when only a lad he had deflowered. And later, being then married to one Lucius Cassius Longinus, a man of consular rank, he did take her from her husband and lived with her openly, as if she had been his wife. So much so indeed that having fallen sick on one occasion, he made her heiress of all his property, including the empire itself. But it fell out she died, which he did grieve for so exceedingly sore that he made proclamation to close the courts and stay all other business, in order to constrain the people to make public mourning along with him. And for a length of time he wore his hair long and beard untrimmed for her sake. And when he was haranguing the Senate, the people or his soldiers never swore but by the name of Drusilla. As for his other sisters, when he had had his fill of them, he did prostitute them, and gave them up to his chief pages, which he had reared up and known in very foul fashion. Still even so he had done them no outrageous ill, seeing they were accustomed thereto, and that it was a pleasant injury, as I have heard it called by some maids on being deflowered and some women who have been ravished. But over and above this he put 1,000 indignities upon them. He sent them into exile, he took from them all their rings and jewels to turn into money, having wasted and ill-guided all the vast sums Tiberius had left him. Nonetheless, did the poor girls, having after his death come back from banishment and seeing the body of their brother ill and very meanly buried under a few clods of earth, have it disinterred and burned and duly buried as honorably as they could. Surely a good and noble deed on the part of sisters to a brother so graceless and unnatural. The Italian, by way of excusing the illicit love of his countrymen, says that, quote, "When Monsieur Barnardo, the young ox, stand up in anger and in his passion, he will receive no laws and spare no lady." End quote. With the rise of Romanticism, an interest in incest was also revived. The poet Shelley turned to Renaissance history for the story of a degenerate family, the very wealthy Roman family of Francesco Cenci. Cenci committed incest with his daughter Beatrice, 1577 to 1599, who, with her stepmother and her brother Giacomo, had him murdered by hired assassins who drove a nail into Cenci's brain, September 9, 1598. Beatrice was far from beautiful and by no means moral. She gave birth before her trial to an illegitimate son. Shelley, however, made her both pure and beautiful, and turned the story in part into an attack on the papacy. His purpose in The Cenci he stated in the preface, quote, "The highest moral purpose aimed at in the highest species of the drama is the teaching the human heart, through its sympathies and antipathies, the knowledge of itself, in proportion to the possession of which knowledge every human being is wise, just, sincere, tolerant, and kind." End quote. Mario Praz has called attention to the romantic interest in the perverse. What for the Romantics was a subject of literary interest has become for the existentialist and relativistic humanists of the 20th century a matter for exploration and practice, an aspect of sexual liberty. It is now defended by a British sociologist. A medical doctor has written on the quote-unquote normalcy of incest and of the supposed problems resulting from quote-unquote suppressing incestuous desires. Such works are bringing fortunes to publishers of pornography. To return to Blake's observations, his comments on abortion are revealing. Quote, "Legalized abortion laws are being seriously sought by many respected physicians because of completely legitimate problems facing some of their patients. But the free lovers are also the champions of new legislation in this regard simply because unwanted pregnancies are the inevitable result of their irresponsible conduct. Daughters are sometimes impregnated by their own brothers or fathers. Children from 9 to 15 often find themselves with child in these environments, and the quote-unquote intellectual advocates of this way of life offer no practical solution save the quick abortion, cheaply and competently performed." End quote. The free love advocates begin by offering quote-unquote life to their followers and end by demanding death, legalized murder in the form of abortion, as the release and escape from the consequences of their actions. This is not surprising. Death, in any life and law system, is an inescapable fact. The question is, death for whom? The humanist demands death for God's law order, death for unborn babies, and death for virtue and godliness, whereas God's law requires death ultimately for evil and for rebellion against God's law order. In biblical law, the guilty, not the innocent, die. The penalty for incest is thus death. A final note. The subject of inbreeding has attracted in recent years more than a little attention. The evidences of its dangers are many. The decline of European monarchies was in part due to the decline of the royal families due to excessive inbreeding. The serious mental and physical defects which appeared in royal families, which in origin were notable for physical vigor and mental abilities, is well known. Marriages were contracted by various monarchies not in terms of inherent qualities, but in terms of quote-unquote royal blood and advantageous political alliances, so that genetic considerations were sacrificed to political ends. The awareness of the necessity for improving the human stock has led some to advocate massive outbreeding as a means of genetic progress. As a result, racial interbreeding has been suggested, more often orally than in writing. But new strains can add nothing to a bloodline except what they already have. Outbreeding with inferior stock can only add more problems to the already existing ones.